hopefully that works. All right, so thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here. After that wonderful introduction, I have to say that I disavow everything. So everything that I'm going to hear today is actually my own research and doesn't reflect sort of the views of the Sloan Foundation. And I'm really excited to talk about this because I think this is a topic that even though the institutions that I studied over the course of this 5 or 6 year research project don't actually exist anymore, so I was mentioning before, I think the topic about how emerging technologies are analyzed and explored in the context of non-governmental organizations, I think is really interesting and one that's going to be with us for a long time. So the reason that I undertook this study, which I said took me for sort of close to half a decade, is that I think it sits really nicely at the intersection between how non-governmental organizations and nonprofits operate and broader discussions about the role of anticipatory governance within the private sector and in the government sector. So I'll start by giving you a little bit of background on sort of the motivations for my research, kind of why I was interested in the topic, tell you some of my research questions, talk about the methods I use, and then try to highlight some of the findings. I recently sort of published the work in a book. I won't be able to cover everything here, but if you're interested, I'm sure the Berkeley Library has a copy of it. So elections continue to be on our mind, but I want to kind of bring you all back to 3 presidential elections ago, back in the fall of 2008. And every sort of election period, Science Magazine puts together sort of a 2-pager that looks like this, which is kind of, if you can read it down here, it says a full serving of science awaits the next president. So they kind of put together these sort of top 10 lists of what are the interesting emerging science and technology research questions that whatever new administration is going to have to deal with. You don't kind of need to focus on the details obviously here because you can't read them. This was published in October 21st, 2008. And one of the ones that I thought was kind of really interesting was this sort of little capsule called Small Comfort, which focuses on nanotechnology. So it talks about sort of the market share that nanotechnology products have, 50 billion worth in 2006, some folks estimated. There was a lot of regulatory discussion going on around the safety of nanomaterials. It talks about federal agency coordination through the National Nanotechnology Initiative, and sort of framing this challenge that the next president will have to decide, how the country will deal with nanotechnology going forward. I think this is really interesting because it's one of the first times that you get nanotechnology sort of raised onto the level of sort of a high-profile science policy issue, in addition to things like, weapons security, space exploration. You sort of get this issue rising to the top in a way that it hadn't before. And one of the things that really interests me is that, especially back when these discussions were happening back in 2008, a lot of the discussion around nanotechnology was around sort of futuristic uses of nanomaterials. And one of the things that a little capsule like this starts to begin to talk about are some of the bread and butter safety, toxicity, regulatory issues. And I was really kind of concerned and interested in how do these issues get framed this way? How do you go from something that was talked about in the context of space elevators or nanobots replicating and kind of get reduced into this bucket of regulatory safety and policy? So that's sort of the science and technology side, and then I've always been interested in how the government kind of begins to anticipate the societal impacts of new technologies. So many of you are aware, for a number of years there was the Office of Technology Assessment that was closed down in 1995 that was kind of tasked with being the federal government's sort of rapid response, or at least supposed rapid response, to understanding how a wide range of new technologies might evolve. After OTA was closed in 1995, one of the things you began to see is a number of high-profile non-governmental organizations began to look at emerging technologies. And I actually thought that was a more interesting sort of field to look at. So there's a lot of research that you may have read that kind of laments the closing of the Office of Technology Assessment. And I think that that's interesting and that's important to understand, but I think there's sort of an avenue to explore to think about how these other types of institutions outside of government can begin to look at the societal impacts of new technologies. So there's interest in the field. There's lots of opportunities to share learning across different NGOs and institutions that are working across different technologies. And there actually are a lot of interesting examples that emerged over the past decade or so to look at from a research perspective. The other thing I think is that when you think about how does our government try to anticipate the societal impacts of new technologies, if you were to kind of recreate OTA today, you probably wouldn't do it the same way it was done back in 1972 when it was started. You'd probably actually want to think of something that's much more distributed, flexible, more of a network of institutions that kind of reflects a little bit of what was happening in the non-governmental sector. So this led to my interests in understanding the strategies that are influential and anticipating the longer-term impacts of new technologies. So that's kind of one research question I tried to explore. And the second is that I was trying to understand how could these strategies and practices be actually institutionalized in various forms of policymaking. So that's kind of what I set out to study. By the way, I'm happy to have people interrupt me during the talk if anybody has any questions. You don't have to necessarily save them till the end. So in sort of undertaking this research, I adapted and built on the theoretical framework of anticipatory governance that you may be familiar with. This emerged in the academic literature over the past few years, and it sort of has served as the canonical description of how to think about the societal impacts of new technologies. Much of it comes from researchers at Arizona State University, and it has three distinct elements, some of which I actually adapted and adjusted for my purpose. So the original theory was developed for thinking about how researchers in universities can kind of think about the societal impacts of new technologies. I worked with some researchers in DC who were thinking about this concept in the context of government action, but neither of those theories actually kind of worked well when you thought about the role of NGOs. So one of the things that I did was kind of adapt it a little bit for my purpose. So the first theme in underlying anticipatory governance, all sort of forms of it that exist in the academic literature and in the gray literature that's out there, is this notion of foresight, right, which involves looking ahead to try to anticipate alternative futures. Many folks use tools like scenario planning, trend monitoring, lots of different ways of thinking about the different ways that new technologies might evolve going forward, and this still remains at the core of the theoretical framework that I used. The second dimension, which is one that I adapted a little bit, is what I call boundary spanning, and there's obviously a very substantial literature related to boundary spanning in the STS world, and I think it's particularly relevant given that one of the almost constant explicit goals of most non-governmental organizations is that they're supposed to help build bridges between researchers, between activists, between people in the private sector, between governments. So this seemed like a natural fit and a natural literature to draw on. And then third, thinking about it in the context of NGOs, the original theory talks a lot about engagement, about public engagement, which is obviously sort of the focus of much work now in STS. But there was also an element that kind of that original framework ignored, which is really about the role of communications within a non-governmental organization, right? A lot of these organizations are not just aimed at engaging members of the public, although many of them are, but they're also trying to get their message out to policymakers and other stakeholders. So a lot of them do things like focus groups, surveys, dialogues, public meetings. For the engagement side, a lot of them also invest significantly in communications, and I explored that a little bit as well. And I think one of the things that will come up over the course of the next few slides, and is kind of one of the main messages of my talk, is that most NGOs have a dual purpose, right? A lot of them sort of try to take a longer view to help envision where these new technologies are going, but they also, for a variety of practical reasons, they need to raise money, they want the attention, a variety of reasons, they want to have an immediate impact on day-to-day policy discussions. So there's often a tension between a lot of the work that they undertake that I tried to highlight in some of the research that I did. So what did I actually do? So I looked at three different institutions that looked at, three different non-governmental efforts that looked at thinking about the future of nanotechnology and synthetic biology. So one important disclaimer is that I was briefly working at the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, which was based in DC, but I had since left there for a while before starting my research. So both the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, which I'll call PEN because it's easier, and the Synthetic Biology Project were housed at the Wilson Center. PEN was the earliest. It started in 2005. It received over $6 million from the Pew Charitable Trust. That was its main funder. And most of its work wound down in around 2010. The synthetic biology kind of spun up around near the end of PEN's time, around 2009, 2010, and it kind of operated until about 2014, 2015 before winding down. And then the third group I looked at was the International Council on Nanotechnology, ICON, which was based at Rice University. So it was an independent effort sort of embedded in a university research center. It started in 2004. It also mostly wound down in 2010 and with a little bit of tail set of activity going to 2013, 2014. So these groups kind of operated in the middle of the last decade, and many of them had very similar mission statements. So the mission statement for PEN, for instance, is that it was dedicated to helping ensure that as nanotechnologies advance, possible risks are minimized and public and consumer engagement remains strong. The Synthetic Biology Project had a same kind of theme related to synthetic biology. ICON articulated its goal to develop and communicate information regarding potential environmental health risks and fostering risk reduction while maximizing societal benefit. So all of these groups focused on risk-benefit calculations. Some focused a little more on the benefits and the risks. Some focused, framed the costs a little bit more. But all of them sort of managing risk was a key issue. Just to give you a little bit of example, I know this is kind of hard to read. So one of the things I did in the study was kind of create timelines of activities, especially focusing on PEN, which was sort of the core part of my analysis. And one of the things that you can see, and this is typical for some of the other groups that I studied, is that you kind of get these sort of clusters of activities. So there's kind of a wave of effort that tends to happen with a lot of these organizations where they kind of, they kind of put out a product or a set of products that gets a lot of attention, then it kind of dies down, and then kind of ramp up again with another set of activities. So PEN kind of had three waves of activities through the production of reports, congressional testimony, online inventories, and a few other things that I'll talk about in a second. So what did I actually do? And I thought this might be useful for, especially for those of you who are students or working on your research or thinking about research design. Something I actually spent a lot of time doing. So it was a primarily qualitative research project, and I really tried to use a good number of different research methodologies to triangulate the findings that I had. So I did over 50 semi-structured interviews. These were people from academia, industry, government, NGOs, journalists that cover the technology sector. I talked to congressional staffers, people from the US and abroad, NGOs in the US and abroad, members of the organizations I studied, and people outside it. I recorded the interviews. They were transcribed professionally. I always kind of disclosed that I had a previous affiliation with the Wilson Center, but that really didn't have much of an impact on folks. They didn't really care about that a whole lot. One of the interesting challenges was that I had about an 80% interview completion rate, so I probably ended up reaching out to about 65, 70 people. Especially in government, it was really hard to get people to talk to me. They usually had, either they just weren't allowed based upon their institutional policies, or they were slightly nervous about what might come out of this. Everything in my own research was de-identified, but there were still a little bit of trepidation in some instances. The second thing I did, which was I analyzed 2,000 pages of documents, so internal and external documentation. So these were reports that these groups put together, strategic planning memos, articles written about them. I also did sort of listen to a bunch of multimedia, podcasts, videos, pictures I looked at, and all this material, the interviews, the documents, were put into a qualitative data analysis software, Atlas TI, where I coded them, looking for patterns and sort of key themes and ideas that emerged from it. The other thing I was able to do is do a media assessment. So a lot of these groups actually started before all of the social media phenomena that we all use today, and I think the study probably would have been very different if these organizations were operating, say a decade later. There was an existing database of newspapers that cover nanotechnology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So they provided me with this database of 1,300 articles from 2003 to 2011. I also did a whole press release and website content analysis. So I really tried to look at these institutions from a wide range of perspectives and using a whole different range of data collection methodologies. So what did I find? So basically, I identified a set of key learnings that kind of emerged from the research. I think, so I know this might be a little difficult to read, but I think there are a few points to make. One is that these empirical findings are not mutually exclusive. So a lot of them are connected. So for instance, when you think about this notion of regularly updating knowledge through repetition, which I'll talk about in a second, one of these attempts to sort of bolster the credibility of the institutions that I studied, a lot of that is conducted through creating boundary objects, through creating information products that folks from different perspectives and different fields can come together and work on and bring in from their own point of view. A lot of this communications and public engagement work around framing a clear message, saturating the media landscape, a lot of that might not sound that shocking, obviously, but when used in conjunction with things like bringing in external experts to bolster your credibility, it actually had a fair amount of impact, at least within the specific areas of work that these groups were taking on. Yes?
Could you please give us a little bit of a concrete example of your questions? Because I'm seeing your question that you asked so many people and
right.
The results with an overview, but in between.
Oh, so the actual research questions. So there were, I don't have the interview protocol on me right now, but a lot of them were relatively open-ended. So I asked specifically about, so I kind of bracketed them around foresight, boundary spanning, and communication. So they were sort of sets of questions in each group. I would ask about how well they thought the various institutions kind of helped think about the future of nanotechnology. I don't ask them to give examples. I'd ask them to talk about what specific products from each institution they used or knew of. I asked them to tell a story or give an example of instances where they thought these institutions did well, they didn't do well. I usually left it pretty open. There was a question near the end where I was kind of sum it up and I'd say, what kind of impact do you think these groups had in the field of nanotechnology policy or synthetic biology policy? As you can imagine, for most of these interviews, after a few questions, they kind of, if the interview flowed, it kind of went well and they kept going. I didn't talk about each group with each interviewee. Some of them were more expert on nanotechnology versus synthetic biology. So some of those questions were tailored based upon the topic. There were some that I explicitly talked to who I thought could do well cutting across the different fields, and there were some where I also actually explicitly looked for people who I suspected might be critical of the institutions to try to get that point of view out. That was actually hard in some cases, but it was something that I worked on. All right, so what I thought I might do is just highlight some of these strategies and kind of how they express themselves in the interviews and in the analysis. So one of the strategies is what I call bringing the future into the present. So especially the Project in Emerging Nanotechnology, PEN, was very focused on trying to make clear the present day impacts of things like nanotechnology. And one of the ways it did it was through this creation of this consumer product inventory. They called it the CPI. And the CPI was released as an online tool in March 2006. It had 200 entries. And basically what it was a list of products that manufacturers claim contain nanotechnology. So this is a washing machine where supposedly the drum of the washing machine was lined with silver nanomaterials to be antibacterial and antimicrobial. This is a food product packaging. I actually bought this when it was on when it was being sold. Right in the box it talked about using nanomaterials against silver nanotechnologies embedded in the plastic to keep your food fresher for longer. This is toothpaste. I think it's from Korea that supposedly use silver nanomaterials to keep your teeth fresh. There's a whole series of cosmetic products as well. There are some things like pants and tennis rackets. So the goal of this inventory was to basically just create a online searchable list of these products. It started out with 200. By 2011 it had over 1,000 products, and when Penn closed down, it actually transferred this inventory to researchers at Virginia Tech, who I believe still keep it up to date. When I last checked a year or two ago, it had about 1,800 products listed. So this was a really interesting sort of element of the institutions to study. So I asked people a lot, as an example, about how the consumer product inventory, what kind of impact it had. You know, how did having this very high profile list, so for a number of years it was hard to read anything in the nanotechnology policy literature that didn't cite the consumer product inventory in one way or another. So these are some things that came out of the discussions of the consumer product inventory. So for instance, one person said, you know, Penn's greatest influence was bringing the reality of nanotechnology to the fore, and there were lots of interviewees who basically say, you know, this inventory was great at crystallizing the issue, right? Because I can now identify a product that may have to go through a regulatory process or may have to be reviewed by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So there were a lot of discussion about how well this inventory actually helped make nanotechnology feel real and immediate. There were lots of dissenters as well, so I like this quote: "This inventory drove me bonkers for years. It was cited as being complete and representative, which was not the case." This person had a really interesting take on it, and how sort of the inventory had this sort of force just by the fact that it was cited so frequently. So just by the very fact that people referenced it, people thought it was complete and comprehensive. You know, this person said people just willingly kind of cite it and say that there are a certain number of products on the market. So that's kind of one interesting strategy, which is, you know, finding ways to bring the future into the present. The second one, which I talked about, is regularly updating knowledge. Again, this may not seem that unusual, but when done effectively, it actually can have a very strong impact on policy discussions. So one interviewee I talked to basically said everything that the project in emerging nanotechnology did in synthetic biology is reflective of what they did in nanotechnology. Because both projects ended up, were at the same institution, they shared similar staff, you actually saw in the work products that they put together similar charts, similar graphics. And in part that was done because the work that the project in emerging nanotechnology did on nanotechnology policy got so heavily cited. So for instance, they did surveys every year on public perception polls of nanotechnology, which got cited very often in the media. Members of Congress during congressional hearings would cite the consumer product inventory or information contained in one of the reports that the nanotechnology project put out. They would cite them on an annual basis. So what ended up happening is that when I talked to people during the interviews, is they said they were kind of always waiting for the next thing to come out. Like they always knew that there was something coming, you know, that they knew that there was another public perception survey or another report coming out. And that sort of volume of material sort of covering the same ground year after year, constantly giving new information, was very effective at keeping a lot of these institutions at the forefront of discussion. So shifting a little bit to this notion of boundary organizations and boundary objects, something I'm sure a lot of you kind of think about and study. This came up in a few different ways. So one is that when you think about ICON, again, which was a group of academics that created this entity to kind of think about the environmental risks and benefits of nanotechnology, they actually structured themselves as a boundary organization. So they actually had equal representation on their board of directors of people from government, academia, industry, and NGOs. One of the challenges that brought with it was that it was very hard for them to actually put out a lot of material because every single stakeholder group literally had to sign off on it. And they were literally trying to build a bridge between those four institutions that was baked into their institutional activities, and it made things challenging. In a little bit of a different way, so the synthetic biology project, which is the only one that I looked at that was not nanotechnology, it was in synthetic biology, actually worked to embed itself very much in the do-it-yourself biology community. So there's a whole world of folks that are working on biological research in non-traditional spaces, you know, the garage hacker, things like that. There are a lot of maker spaces that have a biology component. The synthetic biology project, you know, unusual for a lot of Washington think tanks, literally sent people to these places and got to know them and visited with them and worked with them and tried to understand the research that were being done at this very grassroots level, and then they would be able to help entities that had more of a DC focus, EPA, FDA, understand what was going on in these communities that many of the regulatory agencies were not nearly as well represented, you know, in Brooklyn at a DIY hacker site kind of thing. Third is that, you know, there was this really interesting tension between having Penn focus on nanotechnology housed at the Wilson Center. So for those of you who don't know, the Wilson Center is actually the national memorial to Woodrow Wilson. It is sort of the intellectual equivalent of the Lincoln Monument, or Lincoln Memorial, or the Washington Monument, but instead of creating a statue in Wilson's honor, they created a research center because Wilson was the only US president to have a PhD. And especially back in the mid-2000s, the Wilson Center was viewed as having this sort of neutral take on a lot of public policy issues. And a lot of people said that just the fact that the project was part of the Wilson Center gave it a very neutral luster. All right, so the next strategies. I'm going to go through a few more of these. So this notion of leveraging expert credibility. So this is Mike Honda, I think was a former California representative. He did a lot of work on the environmental impacts of nanotechnology when he was in Congress. And one of the things that came out from the interviews is the ability to bring in external authors, you know, credentialed, as one person said, voices to the debate. Penn in particular was very good at, whenever it released a report or a piece of analysis, it came with letters of endorsement from multiple sectors. So they would often release a report and there'd be an industry statement in support of it, an NGO statement, maybe somebody from abroad. And over time, they actually developed a lot of very strong collaborations with other institutions. So the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is an industry association, they did a lot of work on nanotechnology and food, federal agencies, folks, institutions abroad. So this inside-outside dimension was actually really quite important here. But this brings up a challenge. So this is kind of a quote that I found was really interesting, and it's kind of something I think that speaks to the challenge that NGOs face even when they're trying to be, you know, quote, down the middle, right? So when you think about Penn, this person said it played an important role. It was had a very peculiar and unique status, right? It was governmental because it was sort of housed in the Wilson Center, but it got most of its funding from outside the government, so it's non-governmental. It's innovation friendly, but it pays attention to safety and ethical aspects. It's activist and academic. It's neutral but engaged. So I think there's this interesting tension about how do institutions stay neutral but engaged in research in areas of work around new technologies. So let me turn a little bit to the communications and engagement side, and then I'll wrap up. So one of the things that I did, as I mentioned, was kind of study this database of nanotechnology newspaper articles. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but basically I went through them and coded for 11 different NGOs that were working on nanotechnology policy. some of them were like Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council. Some were more anti-nanotechnology, like the ETC group. Some were more pro-innovation around like the American Chemistry Council. And basically was tracking how often these institutions were mentioned in different newspaper articles. And then I was looking at the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies. And when you can see that kind of black line up there, there was the sense, at least amongst the sort of practitioners in this field, that certainly the Project Emerging Nanotechnologies kind of ended up dominating a lot of newspaper coverage and a lot of, at least, sanctioned debate around nanotechnology for the years it was operating, especially from like 2005 through about 2008, and then it kind of fell off near the end there. One other thing that I think is actually, may seem silly, but I actually think is quite important, is what one interviewee spoke to called having a coherent design philosophy. So one of the things that more than one person mentioned when I asked them sort of what gave some of the analysis that these groups took on sort of weight, is they said they looked really good. Like it was actually analysis that was packaged well, that it had a coherent design philosophy. One person said, you know, the look and feel of the material was formidable, and it made the message they put forth even more striking, right? So they used images, pictures, branding. So this is on nanotechnology and this is on synthetic biology. And in a crowded, you know, challenging policy environment, this actually helped them stand out. One person said, you know, it seems trivial and kind of a silly in lots of ways, but it does make a difference. One person even said that we keep each of these, Penn, for instance, put together about 19 reports on nanotechnology. They have them all on their shelf as like a little reference library. So this is, you know, I don't want to make too much of this, but I also don't think it should be understated. So one of the things I also tried to do is put together a few cross-cutting lessons and conclusions, which are in the book, and I have a table on it, but let me highlight a few here. So one is this notion about effectiveness depending upon, as someone called it, a moment in time. So as I said, all the institutions that I studied have all closed down. There really haven't been many others that have started up to look at nanotechnology or synthetic biology. And this is from sort of a senior policy analyst who I spoke to, basically said, you know, when circumstances may be creating alignment or an opening where implementation becomes possible, solutions that work today or tomorrow might have been totally impossible earlier, so when the situation is right, you better be ready. So this speaks a little bit towards a lot of in political science. You think about Kingdon and windows of opportunity, and how, you know, institutions often have to spend a lot of time working for until the right moment where their issue pops up on, you know, emerges from a policy perspective, and to really be ready with the research and the analysis that's needed to answer the question. One interviewee I spoke with also noted that nothing filled the void when all these institutions left. So that raises a bunch of puzzles and tensions, and I pose these really more as just sort of questions and things where I think it's important to sort of pursue research going forward. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this field to try to understand what's the best way to combine a future orientation, how NGOs can think to the future, but also have present-day influence. I mean, I think things like, you know, creating an inventory of products that everybody can understand is one way to do it, but there are lots of other ways to do it as well. I think there's a tension between being neutral and being interested in the issue. Like, how do NGOs and other research institutions that are supposed to be down the middle, how do they kind of take a stand, which a lot of these institutions still did, on policy issues and other matters? And then kind of what's the role of traditional communications in this era of dynamic two-way public deliberation? So, you know, even though a lot of these groups have closed down, you know, one interview I spoke to basically said, you know, the legacy of these groups is to not wait for bad things to happen and then clean them up afterwards. You know, the goal is to be proactive and imagine what could happen, and if that becomes the model of NGOs working in the space, that would be a tremendous legacy. So let me close with a few final thoughts. So I think that there is sort of a translatability of some of these lessons to other institutions, working different research topics, different operating environments, state, local, international level. I think there's room to sort of think about that as well. I think there's interest. It could be interesting to think about the legacy and influence of these groups as they recede into the past, right? I mean, if you probably did this study today, you might get different answers, given that a lot of these groups have now been closed for 4 or 5 years. And I think I always kind of end with a plea to really examine in practice the effectiveness of these non-governmental approaches to anticipatory governance, because I think that's the wave of the future. So maybe with that, I'll stop and say thank you very much.
So we have all sorts of things today. We have some discussant remarks by our own Ann Keller. Ann Keller is Associate Professor of Health Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health. She has a PhD in Political Science in Public Administration, Organization Theory, Health Policy, and Environmental Health Policy subfields are where she publishes. She was a postdoc at Robert Wood Johnson Scholars in Health Policy Research Program. So has some good resonance with what we've just been talking about. So I'll pass it over to Ann. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. That was great. It's exciting to get to see an empirical project where someone went out and talked to people and did it across a number of organizations. I think it's a hard thing to do. I think in terms of research, it's hard to get to do. You did plug me in. Can you guys hear me back there?
It's not a video volume. It's just the recording.
Oh, it's not recording. No worries. I'll see if I can do this. Okay, so I think it's great to see a project where the researcher is examining more than one organization and is talking to people about what that organization is doing, both within the organization and the surrounding community. And I think it's very hard to do. Those things are very time-consuming, and access is always an issue. You just never know who's going to talk to you and who isn't. So I think it's terrific to see this kind of comparative comparison across organizations work going forward. And I think it's super exciting to see this pitched in terms of thinking about what was Office of Technology Assessment doing, because the OTA was created as an organization that was supposed to be neutrally informing members of Congress about issues related to science and technology, so that members of Congress could make decisions respective to their own constituencies. And certainly if you've read Bruce Bimber's book about OTA survived for as long as it did because it was able to maintain it was able to maintain among its primary stakeholders, members of Congress, this idea that it was a neutral organization. Of course, it didn't last past 1996, the 104th Congress. And Bimber's assessment was that OTA went south because it was low-hanging fruit, not because it had angered partisans in Congress. I think and Bimber wrote that, I think, very soon after OTA was ended. But I wonder if he still thinks that. I wonder if he thinks this is just the beginning of a longer, sort of more concerted attack. So I guess I don't want to spend too much. I don't want to take too much time. But there were two things that I thought that I would ask Evan about, and then I will turn it over to anybody from the audience to ask questions. But one of the things that really intrigued me was whether or not, Evan, you see the CPI, the inventory, as a success of pens or not. And I'll just put forward sort of two things struck me. On the one hand, the fact that people were citing it is certainly a measure of success. It worked in the sense that people were sort of using it. But it sounds like there were also kind of insiders or experts who were saying, well, it wasn't what it purported to be. It wasn't a complete inventory of nanomaterials. And that made me think a little bit about how NGOs, it made me think about whether or not, absent an NGO doing this, would there have been stakeholder demand for something more concerted, maybe more systematic? I don't know that it's easy to do that, but if you hadn't had an NGO sort of stepping into that place and saying, hey, we've got this inventory, this is what nanotechnology, this is what commercialized nanotechnology looks like, would there have been demand for something more systematic? It also sort of raises for me a question about how do these NGOs purport to see technologies? How does one organization or one set of individuals see what's going on in emerging technology? I think that's a very interesting question. And procedurally, it seems like Penn and SynBio went about it very differently. I mean, the idea that SynBio embedded themselves in the DIY community seems like a lot of legwork on their part. So it's very fascinating to hear that they did that. So I guess there's maybe potentially two related questions there, but I'm really interested to know your take on whether CPI was a success or a failure. And then I think for me, the second thing, maybe I sort of forecast that I'm interested in this. I'm very interested in how organizations that try to present themselves as sort of neutrally expert, neutrally competent in science and technology navigate really difficult waters around partisanship or any sorts of controversies. And I wonder how much, did Penn sort of luck into its institutionalization that made it look neutral and kind of stand as a neutral organization throughout its tenure. And what are the potential for other NGOs to have that kind of track record? I'm familiar with, I've spent a lot of time studying agencies, and people said it's sort of an old school way to regulate things. Now we're doing a whole bunch of soft law, and we've got governance strategies and networks and things that agencies are kind of, they're the 1970s, I guess, or the 1980s of science and technology regulation. But we've got these new governance strategies that aren't well captured by formal governmental organizations with titles and things. So I wonder, in thinking about these other governance strategies, how do they navigate how do they send messages about who they are, who are their funders, who are their, what points of view are they bringing to these conversations, and how are they able to sort of maintain a role as kind of conveners or neutral spaces for conversation? And one thing that Evan didn't raise here, but sort of comes up in the book, I think in the conclusion, he talks about sort of what different models might there be going forward, and he raises the idea of sort of large-scale engagement, thinking about using social media. And I wonder especially, I mean, it's very, very first, really in the forefront of my mind is thinking about how much this last election, actors portraying themselves as other types of actors were able to influence what people thought about the two candidates running for the presidential election. And so on the one hand, large-scale social media allows us to think about engagement with publics in a much different way, in a much broader way. And so their accessibility is part of their charm or their attractiveness. At the same time, there's this real potential downside in terms of who's participating. So I want to leave my comments there and give Evan a chance to see if he wants to respond to any of that, or just throw it out for questions.
Maybe I'll respond, but I'll take some questions.
Okay.
Sure.
You have to plug back
I guess
here.
I should.
Thank you.
Get back here. So good set of questions. Okay. So was the CPI a success or not? So put this on. So I think it was a success in terms of getting attention for the organization. So that's pretty clear. The question of whether it's a success in terms of providing an accurate view of the commercialization of nanotechnology, I think is a much harder question to answer. I think it actually was quite good at giving a view of one strand of nanotechnology, which was sort of how a consumer, going to a mall might come in contact with someone, or shopping online, would come into contact with it. What it didn't do as good a job in is looking across the many functional uses of nanotechnology. So there's a big debate in the field about whether nanotechnology is a general purpose technology, whether it sort of underpins innovation in lots of different fields. A lot of people think that's the case, and I'd probably agree with that. But the CPI, what I think it did was constrained a view of nanotechnology, at least during the period where this entity the Penn was active, around, nanotechnology in the marketplace, which, ignores a lot of roles for nanotechnology in health products, in in industrial products and manufacturing, you know, and a whole range of different industries. So I think while it succeeded in getting attention for Penn, I don't think it was completely successful in terms of giving as broad a view on nanotechnology as maybe could have been given in another way, as you alluded to. That sort of second part of question where you asked about you know, how these NGOs relate to different technologies. One of the things there's a quote near the end of my book where people say, you know, that researchers kind of want to move on from one hot area of technology to the next. They go from nanotechnology, and now kind of nanotechnologies, it's had its day kind of thing, and now they move to synthetic biology, and then there's geoengineering, and then there's autonomous you know, robots and things like that. But each technology is very different. So it's hard to do nanotechnology work without large-scale instrumentation. It's a little harder, it's much harder to have a DIY nano world than a DIY bio world. And so part of it is, it's one of the challenges of having an entity that looks across these different technologies outside of government is you really have to have some expertise in those different technology areas and how the research is done and who the key players are, because it's not the same. So I don't actually view, you know, I don't think you can just think about, you know, just equate nano and bio and cognitive technologies and geoengineering. They're not, you know, you have to deal with them differently. You need a different set of skill sets because they're done differently. The research is undertaken differently. So that sensitivity needs to be there. And then on your last question, so about sort of governance strategies and whether kind of Penn lucked into a setting. I do think it was beneficial that Penn and the Synthetic Biology Project were based in an organization that had not worked on these issues before. So I think that was actually really quite critical. So nobody ever thought of the Wilson Center as doing anything related to science policy. Then you have these entities kind of mushroom up, and I think that it gave them a little bit of a runway that they would not have normally had if they were either A, done by an existing think tank that people had already formed their views on wherever they lie in the political spectrum on different areas of science and technology. So I think that's one area. Second, I think ICON did this as well. Again, they were in Houston, so they had a little bit of a different political system. But I think Penn did think about the political balance in ways where when they would get statements of support, they usually have someone who was viewed as being more of a Democrat, someone was being viewed more as a Republican. They try to draw on people who at least at that point were well respected in the environmental community and didn't really have an axe to grind one way or the other. I also think that because they were dealing with technologies that, you know, were presumed to be so far out there in the future that it gave them a little bit of breathing room as well to kind of think about these areas. I think if they had, again, started on more contentious issues before turning to these different technologies, I think it would have hindered their ability to at least communicate with a broader range of stakeholders. Maybe I'll stop there. There and then there.
Can you give an example